Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. Changes following a likely Russian victory in Ukraine, part 28. And we have a number of topics tonight. We'll discuss, a number of problems that are already manifesting themselves before the Russians have won the war, but they will undoubtedly be further impacted, and the trends will be exacerbated when the Russians do win, and the status of the West, including the United States, is degraded by that event. I don't know when that event is going to occur, but it certainly looks like the handwriting is on the wall. Looks like Ukrainian forces are exhausted. It looks like the Russians have hundreds of thousands of troops in reserve. It also looks like there's evidence that they are preparing for a major offensive. I'm being joined by Dee Piers, who is the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends. And welcome, Dee.
I'm glad to be here. Happy to be here for another discussion, right?
Yes, for another discussion. Indeed. Okay, so we're going to discuss a few things tonight, specifically the issue of dollar dominance. That issue is raging right now and will continue to rage and will be intensified by the coming Russian victory in Ukraine. We are also going to talk about the issue of the vassalization of Europe, which we can see occurring before our eyes as a result of this war and the actions of the United States in this war, and the fact that NATO and the European nations are going along with the United States in this war, that Europe is becoming increasingly a vassal of the United States. We're going to talk about that trend, and we're going to talk about how it would be aggravated by we'll talk about the issue of whether it's going to be aggravated by a coming Russian victory in Ukraine, which it seems to me we're on the doorstep of such a victory right now. And finally, we will be looking at some remarks from Yanis Varoufakis, a very well-known economist, one of my favorite economists, formerly the finance minister of Greece for a short while in 2015. He has some views on the hidden power of the US dollar and how America's debt shapes the global economy. So that's the third issue that we're going to talk about here tonight. So to help us along with the first issue, I'm going to put up a piece that appeared in Market Insider. So let me share the screen with that. This piece was written by Phil Rosen on April 17, 2023. So it's a little bit old, but still relevant. The dollar's dominance as a reserve currency eroded last year at 10 times the pace seen in the past 2 decades. The U.S. dollar's reserve currency status has seen gradual erosion for 2 decades. Eurozone strategists said. But last year, the pace of erosion was 10 times faster, right in the middle of currency sanctions against Russia, and then also the dollar's dominant role in international trade is unlikely to be challenged soon, said the Eurasian experts. That's interesting, that name, the Eurasian experts, almost like the Horizon experts. The dollar's standing as a reserve currency of choice saw a steep decline in 2022, even though its strength in international trade remains unchallenged, according to Horizon SLJ Asset Management. Okay. So Horizon is the name of a group. In a Monday note, strategists Joanna Freyer and Stephen Jen calculated that the greenback accounted for about 2/3 of total global reserves in 2003, then 55% by 2021, and only 47% last year. This 8% decline in 1 year is exceptional, equivalent to 10 times the average annual pace of erosion in the U.S. dollar's market share in the prior years, unquote, the author said. The drop-off in the dollar standing as a reserve currency accelerated since the start of the war in Ukraine, in particular. This, of course, is not surprising, since basically the Russians were thrown out of the dollar world, by the United States, and by the freezing, of their dollar assets. So naturally, they no longer traded in dollars. Not really very surprising. Quote, exceptional actions, unquote, namely sanctions taken by the U.S. and its allies against Moscow, made many nations less willing to hold on to the dollar, the report said. Again, not surprising. After Russia invaded Ukraine last year, Western nations largely cut off Russia from the world financial system and froze its currency reserves, forcing the Kremlin to rely more on the yuan, which of course is the Chinese currency that they use for international trading. Actually, I'm mistaken there. That's the renminbi. I don't know if it's correct to say that they rely more on the yuan. But anyway, meanwhile, the euro share as a reserve currency jumped by about 5%, Horizon said, bringing its standing to the same level it hit in 2003 and effectively erasing 2 decades of losses. China's yuan, meanwhile, continued to gain at its usual pace and didn't see a spike as a global reserve currency last year. In fact, as a reserve currency, it's only about 3% of total trades. To be sure, no other currency is set up to challenge the dollar's dominance in international trade. It's still the main conduit for country-to-country transactions, Horizon said. Citing data from the Bank for International Settlements, triennial foreign exchange surveys, the dollar commanded 85% of all currency turnover in 2010, compared to its 88% market share in 2022, the note said. Quote, "We believe the erosion of the dollar's reserve currency status has accelerated, in recent years at an alarming pace, especially since the start of the Ukraine war. While the dollar will likely to continue to enjoy dominance as an international currency for a while longer," it added. Meanwhile, Fitch Solutions said the dollar's dominance will erode over time, but there won't be, quote, quote, a paradigm shift, unquote, given that there's no viable alternative currency for international trade. Of course, for those who've been keeping up on this, there is, the attempt of the BRICS group to arrive at an international trading currency. If they do this successfully, then there will be, an alternative to the dollar. So the baseline view here is, while the dollar dominance has eroded in recent years, there's still no alternative currency, to rival it. So the erosion, according to this article, is going to be slow. But here's a second piece. This is a report from the European Council on Foreign Relations. I'm not going to go through the whole report, of course. It's on the art, of vassalization, how Russia's war in Ukraine has transformed transatlantic relations. That's the title of this report. I'm not going to go through the report. What I'm going to do is just look at the main points of the summary and discuss those. And D, I think you can come in here too quite easily. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has revealed Europeans' profound dependence on the U.S. for their security. Despite the EU efforts at achieving, quote, strategic autonomy, unquote. I have to say, during this war, I didn't see many efforts from the EU to achieve a strategic form, of autonomy. All I saw was the EU caving into the demands of the United States. Perhaps that's because of the war revealing the profound dependence on the United States for national security. As far as I can see, the Europeans weren't doing very much to finance the war, in Ukraine. Most of the money was coming from the United States. Over the last decade, the EU has grown relatively less powerful than America, economically, technologically, and militarily. I'm not sure whether that is really so true from an economic point of view. If you look at, I think this judgment is based on looking at GDP, the nominal GDP. I think, that European GDP right now is something like, it may be 15 trillion or something like that, from the EU. At most, it's 18 trillion. while the nominal GDP of the United States is 25 trillion. But if you look at GDP through the purchasing power parity measure, the EU, while less than the United States at this point, in that measure of GDP, is much closer to the United States, perhaps within 2 or 3 trillion. I'll also say that this decline in relative GDP compared to the United States was probably due to the fact that, to a greater extent, the Europeans bought off, I should say, the neoliberal view of what to do when the recession of 2010 came. They believed that the austerity theorists, were right. So in country after country in the EU, the response to the crash of 2008 was to follow austerity policy at very, very high cost. In some of the nations, in Spain, for example, in Ireland, to a great extent, in Italy also, the unemployment rate for young people was hitting 50%. And the overall unemployment rate in most of the EU countries, well, at least in Portugal, in Italy, in Ireland, in Greece, in Spain, the unemployment rate was hitting 25 to 30% in those countries, because the countries and the EU generally chose to follow the mantra, of austerity, and to cut back on spending as much, as possible. And the EU as a whole was rather stringent in enforcing the idea that deficits could not exceed 3%. Well, the recession of 2008, I don't even know how long it lasted in Europe. It might have been 2012, 2013. That recession was nearly as serious, as the Depression of the 1930s. And it was exacerbated by the austerity strategy of the neoliberal economists, in Europe. Whereas here in the United States, while there was some talk of austerity and some practice of austerity as well, our deficit spending was much higher than that, in Europe. And it served to get us out of the recession faster. It was still slow growth, and we never completely got out of the recession until 2015. But we did a lot better than Europe, during this period, and maybe that alone accounts for the relative gap between the GDP of the Eurozone, and the GDP, of the United States. Next bullet point here. Europeans also still lack agreement on crucial strategic questions for themselves and look to Washington for leadership. That certainly is what happened in this war. This was a failure of leadership, in Europe. It was due to the fact that so many of the leaders were so pro-American and so used to looking to the United States for leadership that they failed their populations and their society during this war. They marched in lockstep behind, the United States, and they could not afford, to do that. we've been looking at the deindustrialization of Germany because of the destruction of the pipeline. And the Germans just swallowed. They simply swallowed that. And they didn't say anything about it, even though they, like everybody else, know that the blowing up of the pipeline was the work of Ukraine, and the United States. And primarily the United States, because Ukraine lacked the technical capability to blow up, the pipeline. Now, the blowing up of the pipeline has resulted in skyrocketing fuel costs for Europe during this period. And that in turn has resulted in the deindustrialization of critical industries, in Germany, and fears that it will be very difficult, that there will be a lot of suffering in Germany this winter. We weren't so concerned about the first winter, after the blowing up of the pipeline, because it didn't look like the lack of the fuel reserves was going to bite until this year. But we now are entering the winter period where the fuel shortages may really bite, in Europe. And you still have, a Eurozone that won't use its fiscal power to lift up the various governments, of Europe, because they're still basically practicing the austerity doctrines, of neoliberalism. Lots of governments still practice them, over there, in Europe. Okay, next bullet point in the summary. In the Cold War, Europe was a central front of superpower competition. True, it was. There was lots of disagreement, in Europe about how closely to follow the lead of the United States. And that was good for the world because it calmed down the extremists, in the United States, and led, the United States to seek agreement with the Russians and to end the Cold War. Things are different now, though. The U.S. expects the EU and the UK to fall in line behind its China strategy and will use its leadership position to ensure this outcome. Yes, this is what's happening. And unless there's a rebellion in Europe, unless some of these regimes actually fall, unless they're replaced by entirely new regimes in France, in Germany, certainly in France and Germany, but this is needed, in the UK also. It's time for the Tories to go. If they keep on, simply blindly backing the United States, there's economic devastation, in the UK right now. The Tories are doing nothing to relieve that. All they know is privatization and cutting back on expenditures, which in the UK is totally unnecessary because the UK is a monetary sovereign. They're in a perfect position to use the fiscal power of a monetary sovereign to kick their economy into high gear. And they won't do it. And so far, the people haven't turned to a Labour government. Now, that may be, in the UK because the Labour leadership under Keir Starmer is so feckless. But if people, in the UK do something to get back to Jeremy Corbyn, maybe something can be done for the economy while the UK plots a more independent course in foreign policy. Next bullet point, Europe becoming, an American vassal is unwise for both sides. And this is really the critical bullet point. The Europeans can become a stronger and more independent part of the Atlantic Alliance by developing independent capacity to support Ukraine and acquiring greater military capabilities. But how can the Europeans do that when the economy is so down and is handcuffed by the high prices of fuel which the European industries have to pay? To kick the economy in high gear, the troika that runs the Eurozone is going to have to, in violation of the Maastricht Treaty, is going to have to allow the individual governments to run higher deficits. And the European Central Bank is going to have to finance those deficits through money creation. That's what's going to have to happen, because in the present circumstance, the nations can't afford to acquire greater military capabilities. They would have to sacrifice completely their social safety nets. If they try to do that, their governments will fall. And there will be political chaos, in Europe. So, will the vassalization increase in Europe? That's a big question. My answer to that question is it will not increase, because the governments that have been vassal governments will fall and will be replaced by more nationalist governments and by more aggressive governments that will want to chart a course that is more independent of the United States. There's nothing to gain for Europe in joining the American effort to continue to support the war in Ukraine, and even more so to surround China in the Pacific. There's no way for the Europeans to project what power they have left into helping to stop the Chinese in Europe. And if they stop the Chinese in the Pacific, and if they try to do so, they're only going to weaken themselves even more, their own economies, because they need trade with China to achieve prosperity again. They need trade with Russia to achieve prosperity again. I believe the people of Europe will come to understand this fairly shortly now, and that they will kick out the governments that are not seeing things in that way, especially the governments of Western Europe. I think now some of the governments of Eastern Europe are seeing this. Certainly that's true in Hungary. The Hungarians have resented the sanctioning of Russia and the freezing of trade. And I think they would embrace, a liberalization and the Eurozone charting an independent course, from the United States. And whether they worry about the military capabilities or not is going to depend on Russia. If Russia ends the war in Ukraine victorious, and then turns aside to the business of doing business wherever they can do business, I don't think the Europeans are going to worry about the greater military capabilities of Russia, because those capabilities won't be directed at them. Anyway, that's my view of things, and I thought that this article was a good foil for stating that view. Dee, do you have any comments?
No, I think you pretty much covered everything.
Okay, you like that analysis?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Okay, let's go on to something else that I thought would be extremely interesting. First of all, uh, okay, what I want to say is I want to cover a clip from Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister of Greece, for a brief period when Syriza first came to power in 2015. He resigned, if I recall, in July of 2015 because he could not take the caving, okay, of the Syriza regime to the Troika, okay, in Europe. Okay, the Troika imposed a period, okay, instead of uh, instead of exiting the EU, the Troika imposed full-on austerity on Greece, uh, brutal austerity, which the Greeks in recent years have only now been coming out of.
Yes, and I have to add to that is the fact that we covered the story with young Israelis going to live in Greece, and they came in. A lot of Israelis came in because it's so expensive in Israel, and they found even though there was economic issues, say in Greece, the cost of living there was lower for them, and some people figured they could travel. Say if they worked in Israel, you know, there was a way to travel back and forth. So it was a lot of Israelis going over there that really helped Greece get out of the mess too.
But I don't think Greece is still fully out of the mess.
No, but the
In other words, Greece
Greece
had,
is trying to more tourism too, to try to get people in there that can put spend into the economy.
that's true, but putting a damper on tourism also
Yeah.
has been the fires in Greece, okay, that Greece was experiencing this year.
Mm.
But unfortunately, and then there's also the problem of absorbing the immigrants, okay, who have
Yes,
come. So I think that Greece has still very, very serious problems, and they have not fully gotten out of the austerity that was placed on them, okay, by the EU.
hmm
But okay, apart from that, I just wanted to say, okay, that Giannis is a very well-known economist and is sought after for speeches because he's a very, very good speaker. Very entertaining. Uh, he's very close to Jamie Galbraith, also close to the Levy Institute, where okay, he's been a follow. He's kind of a fellow traveler, okay, of the MMTers. He's not
Okay.
okay, an MMTer, but he has. Uh, I think that his personal relations uh, with MMTers from the environment that the Levy Institute are substantial. Okay. Anyway, he's a very attractive personality and very articulate, very, very okay, articulate. I think in the beginning he had a philosophy background, but
Okay.
now okay, he's in economics, okay,
Well, that's good.
international economics, and he
Well,
leads the democracy movement, okay, in Europe. Uh, okay, you'll see this film clip is sponsored by DIEM, which I forget what that stands for, but it's his movement to strengthen democracy inside of Europe and to
okay, I
change.
just want to say Friar Steve is here. He just says hello.
Hi, Fry Steve, how you doing? Okay, uh, so Yanis Varoufakis, okay, is a top economist. He's a progressive economist, post Keynesian, okay, economist. Very close to Jamie Galbraith. He taught at the University of Texas for some time. If I'm not
hmm
mistaken, he now teaches at the University of Athens.
Oh,
So he has now, he's given us this particular film clip, and I want to go through it with frequent interruptions, I should say, to do a commentary on it. So I'm going to bring it up now. So this is Yanis Varoufakis on the hidden power of the US dollar, how America's debt shapes the global economy. Okay, so notice how he's looking at our national debt. The fact that we have the national debt and that we sell the treasuries, in his view, is an instrument of our power and maintaining the power of the dollar. So, if he were looking at it purely from our point of view and wanted to maintain the power of the dollar, he would not be someone who was for paying off the debt. So let us look at his point of view now. Let me see if I can get this back to the start of it. I want to get it back to the start. I think I've got it.
The United States is in the red. It keeps buying stuff from China, from Europe, from Africa, from Asia, a lot more stuff than what it sells. For, normal countries, when you have a big trade deficit, then you're in trouble. Then your currency depreciates. Then you have debt crisis. Then the IMF comes to you. And then very soon after that, you lose your schools, your roads, your hospitals. Your people are thrown out of their homes. How is it that the United States have managed to turn a trade deficit into the greatest instrument of colonial power in the history of humanity?
A very interesting question, right? This must be the first time in history that when a country has a trade deficit, this is turned into an instrument of power. Now, the MMTers, have often mentioned that this whole situation, is rather silly. On the one hand, we have our people here who are lamenting the trade deficit and the size of the trade deficit. But when you look at the reality of it, what is really going on is we have a trade deficit because people in other nations want to hold, our dollars. They're willing to export to us more than they import, from us. And what they accept in return for their goods is our dollars. And what are dollars? I mean, these are electronic dollars. These are things on a computer screen. What value do they have for these other countries? Why is it that China, I believe China has accumulated something like $3 trillion, that it sinks into U.S. treasuries, sinks into our debt instruments? And you have to ask, why have they done that? Why have they shipped us goods of real value in return for these little electronic things? And before China did this, the same was true with the Japanese. They shipped us all these cars over here. What did they get in return for the cars? They got these little electronic bits of information and U.S. debt instruments. Where, by the way, do you think the U.S. debt instruments that they buy actually sit? The answer is they sit in Federal Reserve banks, in accounts, foreign accounts in Federal Reserve banks. They're not even held by these countries who have allowed the trade deficits, to develop and to ship us all this real wealth in return for our electronic bits of information. So I thought I would make that point. Here we go, though.
Because that's what it is. Imagine you're a capitalist in Shanghai and you have a factory producing aluminum. And where do you sell this to? The United States. That's whom you send it, whom you send your aluminum to. Why can the United States buyer buy it from you? Because the American has dollars and uses dollars to buy your aluminum. This is the trade deficit. The fact that they can keep buying stuff without selling by printing dollars, which says then the Chinese capitalist, what does the Chinese capitalist do with the dollars that he gets from selling aluminum? He takes it to Wall Street.
Okay, before I go on, the printing of the dollars, it's not really printing dollars. Okay, the dollars are mostly created these days by the Federal Reserve. There's no printing of cash money, okay, that's involved. There's a marking up, okay, of the reserve accounts of people, okay, and companies that happens when the United States runs, okay, a domestic deficit. At that point, the Federal Reserve creates new spending, creates new money so that the federal government can spend it into the domestic economy of the United States. That's what gives the Americans the money that Giannis is talking about here. That's what gives the Americans the means to buy the aluminum from that Shanghai factory. I just wanted to make sure, you understood that it was not really printing. Giannis knows this. He was simplifying.
And there he buys American debt. Therefore, he finances the American government. And he buys real estate. He buys, properties in Miami, in California, in Chicago, in New York. And therefore, you've got this recycling scheme. There is
the recycling scheme. But also, when they buy the profits in New York and Miami and Los Angeles and Seattle and all over the United States, they intervene in the domestic economy here and they drive up the asset prices. They're part of the driving up of the real estate market and the prices we have to pay, which are in part responsible for the rise in housing prices here and for the housing shortages that we see going on.
Why the BRICS are not going to be a significant threat to the dollar is because Russian capitalists, Chinese capitalists, Indian capitalists, Indonesian capitalists, United Arab Emirates capitalists, they do not want to see the dollar being displaced by any currency, digital, crypto, or normal. They want the dollar to remain completely and utterly dominant because their loot, their wealth is in dollars and it lives in the United States financial system. Who came up with the acronym BRICS? A guy called O'Neill, Jim O'Neill. What was Jim O'Neill? The chief economist of Goldman Sachs. He came up with the idea of the BRICS. He was making the point that if you are investing money, you forget about the West. You should invest it in countries like Brazil, in Russia, in China. And in order to make it snazzy, to give it a marketing edge, I asked him, why did you put South Africa in there, the S of BRICS?
Okay, so I guess I have to add here that it wasn't actually Jim O'Neill who put South Africa in there. It was a vote of the other BRICS nations, of Brazil, Russia, India, and China. The BRIC nations wanted to put South Africa in there because they wanted, okay, an African nation in there. So that nation would be representative, okay, of Africa somehow. And South Africa was a good candidate because it's one of the biggest economies that are in Africa. Okay. Okay, so my point is, it wasn't Jim O'Neill who put the S, okay, in BRICS. He might have had something to do with it. He might have been talking to some people there and say, wouldn't it be nice if you had a nation that started with S, so you could be called the BRICS instead of the BRIC? I don't know. He might have suggested that to somebody, but I'm sure that didn't convince the Chinese to allow South Africa into the original BRIC structure. I'm sure they wanted to let South Africa in because they were interested in the Belt and Road Initiative, and that South Africa could be very important for that. But I thought this was funny because it almost sounded, as though Giannis was, it almost sounded as if somebody's trying to come in here. Oh, it's Dee. She fell out. Hi, Dee.
Yes, I fell out. I don't know how.
You fell out. Okay, and you're back. It almost sounded as though he was suggesting that Goldman Sachs actually decided it would be sexier for the BRIC bloc to add, okay, an S by letting in South Africa. And I don't think that is what happened. I also don't think that that Goldman Sachs was responsible for getting the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, and the Brazilians together, okay, in the first place. I really can't see that happening because the nature of the coalition of those four countries represented, let's say, possible competition for the United States from the start. Anyway, I will now go on. I didn't want to leave that impression.
Once I met Jim O'Neill, you know what he said to me? Because one brick didn't sound good, and I wanted an S. So he added South Africa in there. So this is the degree of Anglo-European American dominance. All the developing world is looking at the BRICS as their savior, and the BRICS is an acronym concocted by the chief economist of Goldman Sachs, right?
Okay, that might be perfectly true that the acronym was concocted there, but I really don't think that Goldman Sachs controlled the process of these nations coming together.
No, it's not insignificant. It's not insignificant because an increasing amount of international trade is not going to be in dollars. And the most interesting event of the last weeks is when we heard that Argentina paid a few $1 billion that it owed to the International Monetary Fund using Chinese yuan. If you couple that with the news that the new development bank, which is the BRICS Bank, where Dilma is the president, the former Brazilian.
Okay, Dilma Rousseff, okay, is her name. And she had to quit because the right wing, okay, in Brazil went after her and started to threaten her with lawsuits, okay, and with jailing, things like that. So they got her out of the presidency, which then required this new election, okay, in Brazil, and that was the election in which they kicked out the possibility, okay, of Lula becoming the president again by putting him in jail on trumped up kinds of charges. And so Jair Bolsonaro became the president, okay, of Brazil. And that cut back on any progressive things being done, okay, in Brazil for roughly 4 years, okay, or so. But Dilma survived, and she became the president, okay, of the new development bank, which is the BRICS Bank, which got capitalized by the members of the BRICS with $100 billion, which is more than the capital that was used to start off the World Bank, okay, and the IMF. Potentially, okay, the new development bank may one day be more powerful, okay, because of course, when you start out with $100 billion in capital over a period of time, you can leverage that with loans and various other things and develop a value of that bank in excess of $1 trillion. I have to add, though, the point here. Yes, you capitalize it with $100 billion, but the interesting thing is when you lend out that money, and here's a real important question: do you actually lend out those dollars, or do you simply create further money, okay, out of thin air by giving credits to the borrowers that you're supporting, by giving them credits to use? If you can do that, which is the way, of course, our domestic banks work here, and banks in many areas of the world work, that $100 billion can easily turn into a capability of $1 trillion in loans, okay, or more. And that's a sum to be reckoned with. Now, how can they do that? Well, they can do that, okay, if while having the backing of the dollars, they actually leverage new financial credits. Now, you can see that with Argentina. Okay, I think that Argentina was able to communicate, to aggregate the yuan, which it used to pay back the IMF, because the Chinese were backing the ability of Argentina to do that. Well, to learn more about how that is done, we go further with this film clip, which can teach us a lot.
President is going to be lending in local currencies. And also there's another outfit of the BRICS, a separate outfit, that is going to try to replace the IMF. So when one country, which is associated with the BRICS, let's say South Africa, or any other country that joins the BRICS in some associative form, when they have a problem with the balance of payments, when they can't repay their bankers in Germany, their bankers in England, their bankers in France, in America, then this BRICS IMF version of the IMF will come in and lend them in local currency. Now, what does this mean? What does it mean to be lent in local currency? Well, when Argentina repaid its IMF installment, was something like $4 or $5 billion, using one, all right? What that means is this: the Chinese repaid it. using their own dollar stock. If this new development bank under Dilma lends to Argentina or to South Africa or to Zambia, if they lend money in local currency in South Africa rand to the South African government, what does that mean? I mean, the BRICS Bank does not have rand to give. What it has is dollars, okay?
Mhm.
Or one. It can give them one, or it can give them dollars. Now, for that loan to South Africa to be useful to South Africa, the South Africans, the South African government that takes on this loan must be able to buy stuff from America, from Europe, from India. They will have to pay in dollars. So essentially, they get dollars from the BRICS Bank, but they have to repay in the future with interest the dollars that it cost initially to give the rand. What does this mean? It means that if the rand devalues 50% in the next 10 years, when the loan has to be repaid, this is a good thing for South Africa because South Africa will have inflation.
Okay, here, okay, I want to freeze it again because I think what he's trying to say, and not being entirely clear about it, is that when the development bank, the new development bank, says it's going to lend in local currencies, what it really means is that it's going to lend, okay, in dollars. So the recipient nation will be able to trade. But the recipient nation will have the option, in fact, will be able to repay that loan and cancel that loan in that nation's local currency. That's where the local currency gets involved, okay, in the repayment. So let's notice how important, okay, that is. The Union of South Africa cannot create, okay, any dollars. So it can't repay a loan, okay, in dollars. But it can print its local currency. I don't want to say print. Can create its local currency. That is, its central bank can issue reserves that are denominated in rand. And the way the new development bank is working, he's saying, is that for repayment of loans in dollars, the nations it deals with are going to be able to repay in their local currencies. Of course, they'll never have a problem repaying in their local currencies because they can create those. They can be monetarily sovereign in their local currencies. So this is a fantastic thing for the recipients of the loan. But he also indicated that who's taking the risk for this? What happens if the rand is devalued going forward? Then the new development bank is not getting the dollars back, it's getting the rand back. He's about to say the rand could be devalued by 50%. Okay, and so the new development bank, in terms of value, okay, instead of lending out, let's say, $5 billion, in dollar terms, it might get only $2.5 billion back. Now, if the dollar devalues also, or let's say the rand goes up, okay, and the dollar goes down, then it may turn out, okay, that actually the new development bank makes a profit on the deal. We don't know whether that's going to happen. Okay, but we know that it's the new development bank that is risking these things are going to turn out okay, that the balance, is going to turn out all right, that the rand is not going to completely devalue because the projects the South Africans will conduct, okay, are going to be projects that, okay, are actually productive, and that over time will back the national currency of South Africa so that it's worth something in international trade. That's the bet which is being made here. And I thought this clip, okay, was very useful because he has an idea of what it really means to say that they're lending in local currencies. And it solves the mystery of how can they lend in local currencies when all they have is dollars, K, or or yuan. Well, it's because they're not really lending in local currencies. They're taking repayment, okay, in local currencies. Big difference. Okay, so let's go on with this now. Oh, and he points out that who's really taking the risk here is China, because I presume a lot of the capitalization of the new development bank came from China, and the capitalization was in dollars. Now, how many dollars was China holding? I believe that when they capitalized, the new that bank, that they were sitting with roughly $3 trillion, which they had gotten in return for the Chinese goods. So now he says some very interesting things with that, okay, his background. If I can find the arrow here, I'll go back to it.
The same quantity of rand in 10 years' time will be worth half as much. So they effectively will have to be repaid to the BRICS bank half the money. So it's negative interest rates for the BRICS bank. Who is going to suffer for this? The Chinese, because they are the only ones amongst the BRICS that have a big wad of dollars. So essentially, the BRICS bank means that the Chinese are using their stock of dollars in order to lend the countries that take loans from the BRICS bank and take on itself, Beijing will take on its shoulders the devaluation risk, which now, when an African country borrows, the devaluation risk is its own. It will have to pay for it. Now, why would the Chinese do that? Well, one reason is because they have too many dollars. In the sense that, because they have a very large current account surplus, they keep, with every lump of aluminum or car or whatever it is that they, or clothes that they sell to the Americans or to the Europeans, they get dollars back, right? What do they do with these dollars? They have to take them to Wall Street. Now, they've seen what happened after the Ukraine war, that the central bank of the United States, the Fed, confiscated 350 billion Russian dollars.
So there it is. Because of the power of the United States to confiscate, okay, the dollars, because the debt instruments are sitting in the Federal Reserve Bank, okay, of the United States. So the confiscation, okay, is possible. So when China does something like that and invests, okay, in the bank, the new development bank, with $100 billion, okay, of capital, that's $100 billion that is no longer sitting, okay, at the Federal Reserve, and that can't be confiscated by the United States. So at least the Chinese will get something back, even if things devalue by 50% when the repayment is in local currencies. Okay, at least the Chinese will get 50% of it back. And if the Chinese are making deals with these other countries, and those deals are profitable in certain ways, then the Chinese will make money from that. If the deals are profitable enough, then maybe the Chinese will get back all their money and more without risking a U.S. confiscation of their assets. So this is actually kind of a brilliant move by the Chinese, isn't it? And removes the possible vulnerability created by the power of the United States to confiscate the money that doesn't really belong to us. Going on.
So they think, like, they may do this to us. We might as well use our dollars through the BRICS network to gain more influence over South Africa, over Saudi Arabia. So they are socializing amongst the third world, what we used to call the third world, their dollar holdings. So the BRICS is China. Let's not beat about the bush here. The BRICS is China, with India trying to find a kind of middle road, with the United Arab Emirates playing the West against the BRICS in order to gain advantages, like Saudi Arabia wants to negotiate deals. They don't want to get out of the dollar zone, but they want to enhance their relationship with China, with the BRICS, in order to leverage their own bargaining with the United States. This is all very interesting. But leftists, I'm really appalled. Leftists have a tendency to look at the BRICS and say, this, we are orphans. We in the left are, since 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we've been orphaned. We've been looking at a large power internationally that will look after us, that we will be able to dream that they are our people, that they will defeat the capitalist mammoth, right? Don't make this mistake. That's not what the BRICS is. It's significant. I explained why it is significant, but it is not the new Communist International, the new Socialist International, the new, Humanist International. That's not what it is.
Okay, so that was very interesting, I think, and made some very, very good points. I think the last part, drifted off.
Now you're talking.
What I think might not be very relevant. But the key part of it, I thought, was when he described the process of China through the New Development Bank helping to fund the Belt and Road Initiative and local projects inside of the developing countries. What this can do is result in the development of real wealth for the developing countries that are part of the BRICS. And if those countries develop the real wealth involved, they will have the capability to trade with other nations, and they will have the capability to force the other nations to buy in their domestic currencies, in their local currencies. And over time, that's going to result in the value of those local currencies increasing in international trade. That, of course, means that over a period of time, the risk that the New Development Bank and China will be taking is going to lessen, because the payback will be in local currencies that are worth something. If the projects go well, that is. But the projects do have to go well. There's risk in here for the Chinese. There's risk in here for the New Development Bank. But there's also opportunity. There's also hope. And while Giannis says don't put, too much hope in the BRICS. They're not the return of the Communist International or the Socialist International. They don't actually constitute, the Humanist International. All that is so. Okay, all that is true. But that's not what the BRICS is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a coalition of nations that want to trade with each other and make each other rich through the implementation of new projects that develop the various countries, all the various countries that are involved in the BRICS. This is the vision, okay, of the BRICS. And through the implementation of the Belt, and Road Initiative. And if they carry things out successfully, there will be real wealth created through this bank and through the BRICS nations then trading with each other. And the currencies will be strengthened against, the dollar as real wealth is created in these various countries. It's not so much that the value of the dollar absolutely will go down, but the relative value of the dollar in terms of comparative advantage against other countries will go down because the value of their currencies will be going up. Also, the monetary sovereignty of these nations will be increasing over a period of time. The idea of monetary sovereignty, the concept, is not something, that's an absolute. But if you look at Fadl Kaboob's work, there is the idea, of a continuum, of sovereignty. As the local currencies get more and more valuable over a period of time, it will be more and more possible for these nations to act, as monetary sovereigns. As they borrow money, there's this key here. When a country borrows money from another country in a currency that the first country is not able to pay back, that is a giving up of monetary sovereignty. But what the BRICS Bank is evidently doing by allowing these countries to pay back in their local currency, that means there's no taking away, of monetary sovereignty through the international trade mechanism. If BRICS operates in the way that Yanis described, these countries will eventually all become true monetary sovereigns. Now, for a while, they're probably going to peg their currencies to other currencies. But when they lose that peg, when they stop it, and they allow their currencies to float, in international trade, then they will have the three characteristics of a monetary sovereign: the power to issue their own money, the power to demand that other countries pay for their goods, in that money, and also, of course, the power to allow their currency to float, in international trade. So we will then have a world of monetary sovereigns trading on relatively equal terms. It should be a much more peaceful world. It will be much more prosperous, for the developing countries. There's really no implication that it will be less prosperous for the United States. But there will be fewer deals done, in dollars. as the developing countries grow stronger, and they demand that when other countries want their goods, say their lithium, they have to pay in local currencies, then those other countries are going to have to buy the local currencies with their dollars that start out as being worth more than the developing countries' currencies. I shouldn't have said dollars, but the currencies of those other countries whose currencies have higher value, okay, than the currencies, okay, of the developing countries. So as these countries force the more developed countries to buy in the local currencies of the sellers, there's going to be an equalization of the value of currencies across the international system. Okay, now I don't know if I could be mistaken about that. I don't know if if Giannis saw through to that particular eventual result, but I think it's very very encouraging for multipolarity in the international system. It is very very encouraging for the developing countries and their true sovereignty. And it's not really a problem of the United States because on the international currency exchanges, we can use our dollars to buy the local currencies. That's going to be a pretty easy thing to do. If the local currencies are too scarce and the developing countries want to sell their goods, they will have to create more of their own currency so they can be bought on the international exchange. See how this works? So I think it creates a very, very interesting situation. Now, how does all this relate to the Ukraine war? Well, what the proxy war means for Ukraine, of course, is that it has lost, depending on what Putin decides. It could be the existence of Ukraine as a nation, okay, which will be lost. I don't really think that's going to happen because I don't think Putin wants to run certain parts, okay, of Ukraine, the western parts of Ukraine. I don't think he wants any part of that. So I think he's probably going to leave, okay, a rump state and will probably create favorable conditions also for the rump state to be able to survive, though it will probably be a fairly poor state. Okay, but the more important point here is that the collective West countries, okay, the nations of the Eurozone, will lose prestige because they engaged in this war. And the United States and NATO will lose prestige, okay, because it engaged in this war. People will cease to believe in the military superiority of the Western Bloc over the developing Eastern Bloc of Russia, okay, and China. So people worldwide will begin to doubt that the United States will be able to enforce its will, okay, as a hegemon. And so therefore, those other nations will be encouraged to join BRICS, to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to join other coalitions that aren't governed by the United States, okay, and the collective West, okay, in general. That's going to increase the trading possibilities for the Eastern Bloc. the trading possibilities for BRICS. It's going to increase the pace of development for all, of these countries. It's going to put pressure on the United States to change, its ways. Last night on D's show, we talked about the issue of what does the United States have to offer these days, in trade. Well, of course, it has its weapons to offer. It has its agricultural products, to offer. Agricultural products are important. They're very important. I mean, look at what Russia has done with its agricultural products in foreign trade. There are various materials that we could sell abroad. I don't think we really can sell much of our oil because we're going to need it for ourselves. But we can be pretty self-sufficient in oil for as long as we have to be during the transition to solar, and wind power. But the basic point here is we have to turn inward and redevelop our manufacturing capability so we have goods and services to continue to offer, to other nations in trade for the things we want from those other nations. We will no longer be able to militarily dominate them. We'll no longer be able to coup them to get basically corrupt regimes in there that will allow our capitalists to exploit them. So I think that's the tie to the Ukraine war. If Russia wins fairly shortly, let's say in the next 3 or 4 months, and imposes a peace, on Ukraine, which, by the way, the Russians have recently said they're not interested in any freezing of the war. They're not interested in that kind of a negotiation, which is basically what the United States has had on offer. The Blinken, Jake Sullivan bloc in the federal government is sending out those kinds of messages, to Russia. And basically Lavrov is saying, we're not interested in that. We have the upper hand now. If you offer that kind of deal to us, we're just going to go on and keep fighting, and we're going to dictate our terms, at the end of this. And that's going to have the result that I suggested in connection with the loss, of prestige. It may also create a situation where the European nations think that their best deal is to go to Russia and try to get those low prices for fuel again, and for energy again, to goose their particular industries. They may see that that is the best course for them. And of course, then that will present another trading problem for the United States, because Europe will again be competing with the United States in the area of manufactured goods, as will Russia and China. So anyway, that's the future that I'm seeing right now. And I'm seeing a lot of hope for the BRICS nations, maybe more hope than Giannis, is seeing. I'm not sure about that. But I thought he raised some very important issues that suggested the logic that I just had the pleasure to give. So, D,
Now,
I'm tired. Any comments?
you're bringing up agriculture with trading. It brought to mind the issue with Mexico. The U.S. has with a trade deal they have with Mexico because they don't want the U.S.'s GMO stuff. So the U.S. has a problem. A lot of countries don't want GMO. So,
Right. And so the U.S. has a problem to shift more
mhm.
fully, okay, to organic agriculture,
Yes, they
which,
do.
by the way, would be far better for sustainability of the earth.
Yes.
But I think we can make that shift. I think there's enough know how and enough new ideas in the area of agricultural technology here that if we give the proper support, if the US government gives the proper support, which as a monetary sovereign it can perfectly well do, to small farmers to develop organic and sustainable forms, okay, of agriculture, that okay can greatly benefit everyone, and certainly
Right.
the agricultural industry here. And we will still have a tremendous capability for agricultural production, but it will be the right kind of agricultural production then. Okay, D, more ideas?
Um, no, I just thought it was very interesting, and I agree with a lot what you're saying because I'm just seeing it myself. A lot of things that I watch when it comes to Africa, we see the uprising in Africa, and then we saw the uprising in South America, and we hear from Madeline as well. Is they're tired of the West, the abuse they've received from the Western nations for so long that they're welcoming the change. And it is wonderful to see, especially the next generation rising up.
Yes. It really is wonderful to see. It's wonderful to see the new possibilities, okay, developing in the multipolar world, and it's
Mhm.
wonderful to see that some of those possibilities could be very good for us if we can get
Yes,
ourselves out of this box of wanting to be the hegemon and to oppress everyone else, okay, on Earth. Uh,
it's like it's over with, but the U.S.
yes,
doesn't want to see that it's over with.
yeah, we definitely don't want to see that. Yeah, the neoliberals don't want to see, okay, that it's over with. And they're perfectly willing to use coups and military means and violence and propaganda all over the world to try to sabotage the new multipolar formations. Uh, I think we're going to lose at that. And I'm afraid that if we keep trying to do it, that we're going to be wasting valuable time that we need to meet the climate emergency that we all face, and that we need also to adapt our own economy to the new trends. Okay, okay. It's not so much that we have to compete, okay, with other nations, but we have to trade with them and we have to collaborate with them, and we have to have something to trade that they want, that is valuable to them. And insofar as we are falling behind in technology, falling behind the Chinese, okay, in technology, then we're not going to have a part of those new markets that are looking for the new technological developments. I mean, we really need to get on the stick and change, okay, our attitudes. We really, really do. So, should we turn to the comments?
Yes.
Okay. We had a lot of comments tonight, which I'm always happy to see. Uh, get people saying hello. Robert Copeland says, due to the fact winter is going to be here soon, the country that has more warm weather clothing is going to have an advantage due to the fact that it gets cold, okay, in Ukraine. And who has more warm weather clothing? Of course, it's the Russians, isn't it? I agree, Robert, but it's the Russians. That's the answer. And Steve Wolfbrand says, pretty sure Ukrainians have warm clothes, but if they need some, then I can donate. The Russians can donate too, and they'll probably end up doing that. Two of the BRICS nations which are China and Russia, are going to be in a slow decline due to declining birth rates. Maybe, but they have so much population that if their birth rates decline, the people that remain in those nations are so many that the markets are so huge. If both of those governments use their power as monetary sovereigns to deficit spend and create demand for the consumers in those countries to use, they will still be off to the races. They're not going to decline anytime soon if the government uses its financial power in the right way. I think the Chinese may be more likely to do that, than the Russians, because I don't know how far along the Russians are in freeing themselves from neoliberal economic theories. I've seen some good trends there. And they certainly have some MMT thinking over there, but I think it's just starting. Steve Wolfman says, Doc, I'll try to send you a video of Lambda AI. She seems extremely sentient, but it could be a trick. Thank you, Steve. I'll be very interested in that. Might not be a trick, though. And Friar Steve arrived at 9:35. He says, hello. Hello, D. The other link didn't work. Steve said, Doc, I sent you a pro-an. Okay, thank you, Steve. And Friar Steve says, excerpt. Russians said on Wednesday that the European Union was becoming a vassal of NATO, citing the signing of a joint declaration in which the two organizations pledged to deepen their cooperation in response to Russia's war in Ukraine. I think that, is very interesting, but the piece that I talked about here was a piece from the European Council, on foreign relations, saying that vassalization had gone very far. So before Russia said that, the European Council on Foreign Relations itself said that. And I think that's an important point. The idea of vassalization is recognized by the Europeans themselves, and a lot of them are unhappy about that. Steve says, I sent you a pro and a con. Please have a look. I can't decide. I'll be happy to have a look, Steve. Okay, as soon as this is over, I'll go over there and have a look. And Friar Steve says, Rwanda would have been a much better choice than South Africa to join BRICS. Why Rwanda? First of all, I'm not sure. But if I had to pick a nation in Africa, that would be a better pick than South Africa. And my nation would be Nigeria. And the reason why is because of its huge population. Nigeria is going to be a great power sooner than South Africa, okay, will be, okay, a great power. Stephen says, Doc, I sent you some DMs, but please take a look. You send me some DMs on Twitter or some DMs in Facebook, Steve. It doesn't matter. I'll look in both places. But Friar Steve says, so what happens when the expected Russian victory comes? Absolutely no one thinks Russia will be victorious. Not even Putin anymore. USSR lost to an insurgency in Afghanistan. Yeah, the mountainous country of Afghanistan where it's very hard to find people, and crawled back to Moscow. This will end the same. The insurgency in Ukraine rivals Europe against the invaders in World War II. Also, French resistance. Same outcome will happen. The Russians aren't going to be trying to conquer Europe, Friar Steve. They're going to stop. They're going to dictate terms, okay, to Ukraine. They're going to leave it, okay, as an independent nation. They're going to continue to occupy the Russian parts of that nation. They're going to go get Kharkov and Odessa. And that's where they're going to stop. Then they'll try to help in the reconstruction, okay, of Ukraine, while allowing Ukraine to remain as independent, okay, and neutral. What will happen to Ukraine is it'll become a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It will eventually become prosperous again because of its involvement, okay, in the Belt and Road Initiative. That's the future for Ukraine. And it's absolutely not true that no one thinks that Russia will be victorious. Who is no one? Colonel McGregor is sure Russia's going to be victorious. Scott Ritter is sure Russia is going to be victorious. The Rand people is sure Russia will be victorious. Larry Wilkerson is sure Russia is going to be victorious. Brian Berletic is sure Russia is going to be victorious. There is not one person who has studied the war in detail who thinks that Russia won't be victorious. There is no insurgency against Russia in the Russian parts of Ukraine. There's no insurgency against Russia. There won't be an insurgency against Russia in Kharkov, just as there's no insurgency against Russia in Crimea. There will be no insurgency against Russia, okay, in Odessa. That's not going to happen, Friar Steve. Wake up! For now, the number 2 army in Ukraine is Russia, minus Wagner Group mercenaries. Then why is the number 2 army missing? Why is the famous counteroffensive a failure? Friar Steve, it has captured almost no territory. It is a total failure. Look at the map favoring Ukraine sometime that Brian Barletic shows in his show every single day. And you will see that Ukraine has gained almost nothing. Steve O'Brien says, there's an expression in South America for the hand gesture Lula gave to Biden for not shaking his hand. Oh, you mean Biden didn't shake Lula's hand? Is Biden crazy? Steve says, I can't think of it right now. Something like, quote, talk to the hand, unquote. Talk to the hand is fairly respectful. I thought you were referring to some obscene gesture that Lula gave to Biden. Friar Steve said, sound like BRICS will still depend on US dollars. That is what I am hearing. Well, it may depend on US dollars for the short run till the trade gets going in local currency. But remember, China has a huge amount of US dollars. A huge amount of US dollars. And Russia has $300 billion worth of US dollars, which the US has confiscated, of course, but which the US is going to have to give back eventually. That's going to be part of the peace agreement. If the US doesn't give it back, it's going to be taken out of Ukrainian hides. Friar Steve says, in my observation, BRICS will eventually turn to Bitcoin. Friar Steve, that is ignorant. Bitcoin is not a fiat currency backed by a government and the productivity of any nation. Bitcoin is a castle built in the air by people trying to speculate and make money from a speculative space. It has no reality. Bitcoin remains the same in all countries, and space colonies will use Bitcoin. Give it time. No, because Bitcoin has no government behind it. Where does the legitimacy of a currency come from? It comes from government, because government can tax in that currency and can enforce the payment of taxes. Bitcoin can't do that. Bitcoin has no government. Bitcoin is anarchist. Its whole attractiveness is that it's anarchist. In my observation, Friar Steve, you need to study some MMT and understand what sovereign fiat currencies can do and what the basis of their power is. You really need to get to Stephanie Kelton's book right away. In my observation, you really need to get to my books right away. Why am I advertising for Stephanie Kelton's books? I have 7 books on MMT. Read them. You'll get a really good understanding. They're fairly cheap. In my observation, BRICS will eventually turn to Bitcoin. Bitcoin remains same in all countries, and space colonies will use it. I read that already. Good doctor, you keep saying China versus the CCP. What happens if the CCP collapses? I don't say China versus the CCP. I don't think China is fighting with the CCP. I think the CCP is a vital organization. It is very locally distributed. It has lots of interleaving with local governments and local authorities. It's very decentralized in China. It's also centralized, of course, as well. He asked me, do you think the new Chinese government will keep the same initiatives, or will a new Chinese government look inward, more so? Well, I think that depends on trends in international relations, and it depends on who the leaders are in a new China government. But over the next 10 years, I don't see Xi going away. I see Xi's control getting more popular and more vital. What does it mean for a country of 1.5 billion people to have drawn 750 million of those people out of poverty already, and more being drawn out of poverty every single year? When the people in that country watch that happening, What do they think of their leaders? What can they possibly think of their leaders? It's like in Russia. Putin rescued Russia from the abyss, from the economic abyss, and made them once again a country to be reckoned with. Why do you think Putin has all that popularity, in Russia? Because he's been successful. Friar Steve says China will not settle for 50% loss. I find that hard to imagine. No indicators that they will accept such a loss. Well, if they, of course, they've already given the 100 billion in capital to the new development bank. If they don't like the economic results, then they will give less in the future. But one of the things about the Yanis Varoufakis clip that we have to think about is China's got $3 trillion to make those kinds of investments. Get the money out of its own hands and put it into other institutions where the United States won't be able to confiscate it. Why won't they do it? I mean, the risk of confiscation is very strong. If things get too bad too soon with the United States, the United States is shown that it will steal the money. We did it to Russia. Why wouldn't we do it to China? One reason why we might not do it to China is because China might then go ahead and nationalize all the American countries that are manufacturing in China. Those companies might be worth more than the $3 trillion in bonds. There are a lot of American countries over there manufacturing right now. China could just nationalize that overnight if the U.S. wants to play rough. Friar Steve, think about the interrelations between the two countries, the interdependencies. They limit what the U.S. can do. CCP will take land and resources from Africa by force for repayment versus a 50% loss. No, they won't. Why not? Because the CCP made an investment in the new development bank. It's going to be the new development bank that is going to be taking the loss. If the Chinese don't like that kind of loss, then they will just stop investing in the new development bank. They've invested $100 billion in that so far. They've got $3 trillion to invest. They're not going to go to war over a $50 billion loss. Especially if in return for that loss, they're getting influence in Africa. And they're doing lots of other deals in other parts of Africa. Friar Steve says it's going to get ugly. And Africa itself doesn't need to be out of the frying pan and into the fire. Africa is in the fire now with the IMF and with the World Bank and the gangsterism those institutions have been practicing for years and years and years. Africa hasn't been able to get out of domination by the imperialists. The BRICS is offering a chance, to do that. CCP doesn't look at Africa, as equals. Well, that may be true, but they're putting up a pretty good front right now. The planning of BRICS is still interesting to observe. Putin's plan was all Ukraine. That failed. All of Ukraine will be restored. Ukraine will join the EU. Ukraine will join NATO. Moldova will join EU for Russia to win and improve. They will have to lose in Ukraine. Accepting Russian imperialism come to an end. Friar Steve, you are dreaming. Very likely, one of the impacts of the loss, of the Ukraine war will be the breakup, of NATO. The new regimes, inside, of Western Europe won't see the point of being, in NATO anymore, because the Russians are not going to threaten Western Europe again. They're not even going to threaten Eastern European nations. I know the East European nations will feel threatened because of what has happened, and they will probably want to stay inside of NATO. But I think that NATO is going to break up, especially because the United States will want to put military responsibilities on the NATO states for activity in the Pacific, which the NATO nations have no interest in. They have no interest at all in fighting in the Pacific or building defensive alliances, in the Pacific. After this war, they're going to turn inward, and the EU is going to have to change. It's going to have to allow the constituent countries to run much larger deficits so they can cope with recessions inside of their border. Right now, they only allow deficit spending of 3%. They're going to have to change to allow deficit spending up to 15% of GDP if necessary. If the EU can't do that, the EU is going to die. I mean, the Brits have already left. Of course, the Tories were too stupid to use the fiat sovereign power of the British government. They're so stupid. Steve Wolf Brown says, Khrushchev was a Ukrainian. Khrushchev's mother was a Ukrainian. Khrushchev was for the Soviet Union. He gave them independence. They didn't have independence. They were part of the USSR. Khrushchev did this in 1954, when the breakup of the Soviet Union was unimaginable, Steve. But they have been going back and forth for centuries. Many are intermarried. It's basically a civil war. I think a lot of that is true, Steve. It's a civil war between the Ukrainian Nazis who took over, the Ukrainian government, and the Russians, who aren't having any more of Nazis. Russian agriculture depends on U.S. equipment. That's come to an end, thanks to Biden. You think the Russians can't produce the U.S. equipment, Friar Steve? You think they can't manufacture that equipment in Russia? Come on, Friar Steve. NATO is still the strongest alliance in the world. Putin is in no reliable alliance. Looks awfully reliable to me, given the backing the Chinese gave to Putin in this war. Looks awfully reliable to me. Friar Steve says, as long as Russian forces occupy stolen land in Ukraine, no one will be trading with Russia. Who is no one? China? How about India? How about Indonesia? How about Pakistan? You think Pakistan won't trade with Russia if it has the opportunity? After the war, you think Hungary will not trade with Russia? Come on, Friar Steve. Of course, the African nations are really keen to trade with Russia for Russian wheat. The sanctions will not be followed by most of the nations of the world. The majority of the world's population will be happy to trade with Russia after this war, including the nations of Latin America. Friar Steve says organic is better. Thanks, Doc. Always fascinated with BRICS planning. Friar Steve says, remember the attempted coup, in Montenegro? Vaguely, Friar Steve. Steve Wolfbrand says, bring our boys home, RFK Jr. I completely agree. Unsure how Silicon Valley is falling behind the CCP. I didn't say Silicon Valley was falling behind the CCP yet, but the CCP is catching up fast, as witnessed by the new Chinese phone. That's got 7 nanometer chips in it. Not too far away from where the Taiwanese are. And of course, if there's a reunification between China and Russia, then China will have control over the most advanced chips in the world, right now. So there we are. China may be one election away from planning, the reunification. And they certainly will create a situation in the short run where they can acquire all the chips they want to acquire from Taiwan, even if Taiwan is left, as independent. Friar Steve says, I only see my comments. Woo. Oh, I know why. The reason why you can only see your comments is because a lot of the other comments that are coming in on YouTube. In other words, we are casting to Facebook, to YouTube, and also to Twitter. So normally comments don't come in from Twitter, but they do come in from YouTube and Facebook both. You're coming in on Facebook, Friar Steve. Nobody else is commenting on Facebook. They're commenting on YouTube. Steve Wolfbrand says birthrights will decline worldwide. Hence, the need for immigrants will grow. Friar Steve says Nigeria, interesting. Consider Boko Haram is based out of Nigeria. How would that impact the BRICS? I think, Nigeria will clamp down, on Boko Haram. The point is that Nigeria right now has a bigger population than Pakistan. I don't know if it's bigger, than Indonesia, but it's in the same range as Pakistan, Indonesia, but also Brazil. They're all in the same general range of population, with the Nigerians. Population-wise, Nigeria is a huge country and potentially very rich. And for SS, I would refer back to Foundations of Geopolitics by Dugan. So far, it's all been going as planned. Robert Copeland says, if you're talking about the Dugan, who's a Russian nationalist, I definitely don't think that Putin is following Dugan's particular playbook. I don't even think he talks to Dugan. Robert Copeland, one of the high-ranking generals, want to take over Eastern Europe after they beat Ukraine. That is a Russian general. I don't know what you've heard about that, but I haven't heard anything about any high-ranking Russian generals wanting to take over Eastern Europe. And besides, they're under the control of Putin. And Putin certainly hasn't given any indication that he wants to take over any part of Eastern Europe. I don't think he wants to have anything to do with the Poles. I don't think he wants to have anything to do with the Hungarians other than to have friendly relations with them. Friar Steve says Russia isn't in Odessa. I was there last summer. I know, Friar Steve, they're not in Odessa. What I'm telling you is that they will be in Kharkov and in Odessa as well before they stop. I'm telling you that a major offensive is coming up with hundreds of thousands of troops. They're stockpiling diesel for that offensive. Right now, they've stopped exporting diesel to the rest of the world. I think that offensive is going to occur in a very short time. I don't know if it'll be before the end of the year, or not. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's an October offensive. Steve Wolfbrand says, Nigeria keeps telling me that my car warranty insurance has expired. Yeah, well, that's true, of course. Jeffrey Denton said, part 28. Yeah, this is the 28th installment of changes following a likely Russian victory in Ukraine. Steve Wolfman says, hi, Jeffrey. Friar Steve says, Putin will never get that money back. Well, maybe so, but one way or another, he's going to get that money back. If the United States doesn't give that money back, the incentive will remain to not allow any accumulations of dollar reserves by other nations, because other nations won't continue to make themselves vulnerable to theft by the United States. The taking away of that $300 billion in Russian assets was pure theft, Prior Steve. It has no sanctions from the international system at all. It was a unilateral action by the United States, simply stealing the money. That's what it was. Robert Combs says Bitcoin is too volatile. It goes up and down in value. Why is it so volatile, Robert Copeland? Because it's a speculative vehicle. That's why. Because Bitcoin has no real value except that people want to invest in it in hopes that they can get rich. It's one of the areas where there can be uh, huge price increases over a period of time. And if you're sitting with the right but digital coin, then you know can greatly benefit. Friar Steve says that specifically legitimacy comes from the reliability of the community that creates it. I don't know what you mean by reliability, but what I mean is the productivity in real wealth of the community that creates it. The Bitcoin community doesn't create anything. That's the problem. Stephanie who? Stephanie Kelton. The deficit myth. Steve Wolfbrand. Does a sentient AI deserve rights? Have we created consciousness? I don't know. It's a very pregnant sort of question when presented in the Star Trek series, okay, through Data. One certainly thinks that Data deserved to have rights. Robert Copeland, will robots that have AI take over the world, as some people fear, and that, okay, they can happen? Well, we don't know. Of course, there are many science fiction stories about the AIs taking over worlds, okay, in some way. The Foundation series, okay, is about that. Friar Steve says, good doctor. Who saw the collapse of USSR? USA manufacturing brought China out of debt. It wasn't the USA manufacturing. It was Chinese manufacturing for US companies that brought China out of debt. I mean, let's be clear on what's been happening. The fact that US companies went over there to manufacture and set up plants that were manufacturing over there. Who was running those plants? Who was working in those plants? The Chinese. They were doing the manufacturing. The US companies were only doing the ownership. And yes, they did the planning and they brought over technology. But now China has that technology, don't they? Andy Candy says, been listening. Hi, lovelies. Joe, is Nigeria a very neoliberal country as far as you may know? Well, I think it's more a militarized country than anything else right now, but I think it's vulnerable to the trends, okay, in Africa to get rid of the colonialists. Of course, it's in the U.S. pocket right now, but how long that's going to take, how long that's going to be the case, I don't know. With all their people, I know they have the potential to become a great power in the multipolar world, and I think they're going to want to do that. Andy Candy says, you never hear or read about Africa in general, but it has most of the important resources, right? Now, South America has an awful lot of important resources. The United States and Canada still have a lot of important resources, and there are probably more to be discovered,
Mm-hmm.
okay, in our countries. Mexico still has important resources. Venezuela has important resources. Yes, Africa is a major center of resources, okay, in the world. But Russia continues to be a major center of resources in the world, many still remaining to be discovered in that vast expanse of Russia. Andy Candy says, isn't that why the U.S. is sneaking in and out, conducting dirt there? Yes, Andy Candy, I think so. Fry Steve says, who saw the collapse of the USSR coming? USA manufacturing lifted China uh, um, out of debt. I think China is a much stronger country internally, okay, than the USSR was then. Because the USSR was always highly top down. It did not rely very much on local forms, okay, of autonomy, okay, and authority. There was not much that was bottom up concerning, okay, the USSR. That's why it was so easy for the USSR to fall apart. Okay, the democratic centralism inside of the USSR was an advantage at first and for many years, but it became, okay, the undoing of the USSR because the oligarchy that arises out of democratic centralism became old, okay, and ossified and could not manage the bureaucracy that it had set up, okay, in the country. And it didn't know how to refresh the bureaucracy from the bottom up. It did certain things very well, but it didn't know how to use the market. Now here's China. It's using the market all the time. It constrains the market through its concepts of public purpose. And it generally does things for the people and not for the capitalists. I mean, it's allowed many of the capitalists to get rich in China, but those capitalists don't control China. China's in the process of disciplining the billionaires there to perhaps make sure that they are not billionaires for long. Russia, in its turn, was taken over by the oligarchs, especially when it split up. Situations are entirely different. If China nationalizes U.S. business, we will go to India. You can't see that coming? No, I can see that coming. But if China nationalizes the U.S. businesses, they will still have the productive capacity that's there. They will still be producing the real wealth. They will be able to trade that wealth. It will take years for India to build up to the level that China is now as a manufacturing power. Now, the Indians are very good, and they will build up that way, certainly if the U.S. goes in there and throws a lot of money in there. But we would do better to throw our capital in here and start to manufacture once again here. Because I don't really think that India is as stable as China is. Robert Copeland says, Steve, according to the Poor People's Campaign, there are 140 million people that live in poverty or low wealth, and that was before COVID. Yes. USA manufacturer lifted China poor out of poverty. No, the Chinese government lifted the China poor out of poverty by encouraging all sorts of investments including U.S. investments, and the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party continue to lift China poor out of poverty. The process has not stopped. China's progress is no longer dependent on U.S. business being there. The Chinese have plenty of wonderful businessmen themselves, and their level of innovation right now is easily comparable to the United States. It isn't even funny. Robert Copeland. Steve, according to the Poor People, I read that already. Robert Copeland. Lots of countries in Africa are resource rich, but a lot of people in the African countries are in poverty. Dee, did you watch Timothy Snyder yet? I've seen some Timothy Snyder. Quite a bit, okay, of Timothy Snyder. I like his theoretical work on fascism, certainly. I don't think Timothy Snyder knows anything about foreign policy, though. Robert Copeland says that should be a lot of countries in Africa. Steve says disband NATO. Why do we need that shit? Well, we need that shit because we want our help to isolate their help to isolate China, but it's not in their interest to take part in it. I don't know that it's in the interest of the European countries any longer to have NATO. It depends on what Russia does following the war. If they demilitarize and no longer appear to present a threat, okay, to the European nations, then I think NATO is likely to disband. Robert Copeland says none of the NATO countries, except for Canada and the United States, are on a border with the Pacific Ocean. That's quite true. Doc says Russia won't threaten the EU. Finland and Sweden both have female leaders who just joined NATO. No sign of NATO's security alliance going away. EU is fine, waiting for Moldova and Georgia to join. Georgia will never join. Georgia will never join because the Russians won't allow it. The Georgians know that now, and they don't have the military capability to stand against the Russians. The Georgian effort to join NATO is over. So President Zelensky is a Nazi? No, I didn't suggest that he was a Nazi. What I'm suggesting is that he's largely controlled by the Nazis. He has many of them inside of his government. They were very important, okay, inside of the military. If they're not as important, okay, in the military right now, that's because the Russians have thankfully killed a lot of them. Fry Steve says China didn't give Putin one bullet. Well, Putin did not need to have a bullet from China. What Putin needed from China was their diplomatic support, and they gave him that in spades throughout the whole war. Right now, the harvesting season is right now in Russia. Fry Steve says Hungary is NATO. So no dock. And the wheat is from Ukraine. They haven't had much of a harvest, okay, in Ukraine this year. Obviously, Friar Steve. Steve Wolfman says, I don't understand why we hate Russia. They wanted to join NATO at one point. They did. They wanted to join the EU. Clinton said, no way. They would be part of the EU now. And everybody would be happy. I don't know why we hate them so much. I think the English hate them because they're looking back to the war in 1854, the Crimean War. That's one reason why the English hate them. I have no idea why we hate them. I mean, right now, they're a capitalist country. Why do we hate them and their capitalists? I think the only reason why we hate them is because we stopped them from looting their nation of real resources after the fiasco of the 1990s. What about the dispute between America, Armenia, and Azerbaijan? That's something the Russians are trying to mediate. I suspect they will be successful in mediating it. Steve Hopper says, let's wrap this up. Doc, you are talking genocide. No October offensive. I'm not talking genocide. Why am I talking genocide? This is a war. Talking about Russia ending this war with a military victory and dictating terms. There will be no genocide. Feisty says you can print money at will, can't just print more Bitcoin. That's not the point. The point is the value of Bitcoin has no goods and services and industry and agriculture behind it. It has nothing behind it except the desire of people to try to make money from a gambling casino. Bitcoin is a gambling casino. Friar Steve says the deficit myth. Thanks, Doc. Andy Candy says just throw water on the robots. That'll learn them. Andy Candy says, Wolfie, you sound high. Steve Wolfbrand says, UAPAI, quantum computing, quantum psychics, JWSP, nanotechnology, singularity. Huh? I'm sorry, D.
No, that was background noise.
Oh, okay. Steve said, hi, Andy Candy. Steve says, Andy, why? Andy says, I can't gloat enough about the useful gadgets that I buy on Temu for cheap, like USB rechargeable batteries. China is so advanced just on little stuff. It's mind-blowing. And it's so affordable. Andy Candy says, hi, Wolfie, because you're bringing up deep topics on superconsciousness. And Steve says, I got to get to bed. Good night, everybody. Thank you, Steve. Friar Steve says, Russia is killing their neighbors. So never EU for Russia. Well, I don't think Russia wants to get into the EU anymore because it's having so much fun in Central Asia and in East Asia. And it's starting to have fun in the Middle East, trading in the Middle East also. Doc, Bitcoin is gambling casino. Same thing that Michael Saylor once said. Yep, I know who Michael Saylor is. He's a very bright guy. Once he lost about $20 billion. Fortunately for him, he was still left, okay, with about $1 billion. So he's been able to do various ventures, okay, since that time. But for a while, it looked like he was going to be another Bill Gates. And then he made some accounting errors, and that caused the collapse in value of his company's stock. Okay, folks, it's time to say goodnight. Okay, I am tired. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. It's been very interesting. I enjoyed it. Dee will be back tomorrow night with what I'm sure will be a very good show. And
Yes.
I plan to be there, and I will be back also tomorrow night. I'm not sure with what yet.
I know, right?
Huh?
I was gonna say, yeah, right. Same here. It's see what's happening tomorrow.
Well, we'll see what's been happening tonight. Steve
Yep.
says, good night, everyone. And the Candy says, what another fantastic show tonight. Thanks. Thank you, Andy Candy. We enjoyed it.
Yes. And just remember to please hit the like button, share, and subscribe.
And please remember to buy us some coffees at Buy
Yeah.
Me a Coffee, and maybe even go to my Patreon page. I would really appreciate that.
Thank everyone for the comments and everybody's interest.
All right. This was a really good exchange tonight in so many ways.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes. Good night and good night, Bonnie.
Good night, Dee. Have a real
Yep.
good night. See you
Yes,
tomorrow.
you too. See you tomorrow.